There is a prevailing idea in our society that faith is automatically a virtue. That even if you don't believe in the supernatural claims, the institutions themselves provide a net positive for moral guidance. We are told that religion gives us a framework for being good. But when we actually look at the specific instructions found in holy texts and the dogma preached from pulpits, we find something very different. We find teachings that don't just fail to support morality, but actively dismantle it. These aren't just misunderstandings or the actions of a few extremists. These are core features of the software. When you strip away the tradition and the music and the community aspect, you are left with a set of ideas that, if presented in any other context, would be immediately recognized as abusive. We need to talk about the concept that you are born broken. The very first thing many religious systems teach a child is that they are flawed from the moment of their first breath. Before a child has ever told a lie or hurt a fly, they are told they carry a stain, a spiritual sickness that they inherited. This is a devastating psychological setup. It creates a manufactured problem for which the religion can then sell the only cure. It instills a deep-seated sense of unworthiness that has nothing to do with your actions or your character. It teaches you that your default state is guilty. In psychology, we call this gaslighting. If a partner told you that you were worthless without them, that you were broken and sick and only they could fix you, you would identify that as an abusive relationship. Yet, when a doctrine says it to billions of people, we call it salvation. This leads directly into the next dangerous teaching, which is the suspension of critical thinking, often rebranded as the virtue of faith. We generally agree that in every other aspect of life, evidence matters. If a car mechanic tells you your brakes are shot, you want to see the wear. If a politician makes a claim, you want to see the data. But religion carves out a special exemption where gullibility is framed as a strength. We are taught that believing without seeing is noble. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. This attacks the very mechanism we use to determine what is true and what is false. It trains the mind to accept assertions without proof, and worse, it demonizes doubt. When you train a population to accept extraordinary claims on the basis of authority rather than evidence, you aren't just creating religious followers. You are eroding the societal immune system against fraud, conspiracy theories, and political manipulation. Once you have established that faith is better than evidence, you open the door to the outsourcing of morality, also known as divine command theory. This is perhaps one of the most dangerous concepts in human history. It is the idea that something is good simply because a deity says it is. This completely bypasses human empathy and rational ethics. If goodness is defined solely by the will of a god, then morality is arbitrary. If God commands you to help the poor, you do it. But if that same God commands you to slaughter a neighboring tribe, or shun your child for being gay, or mutilate a prisoner, then those actions become good by definition. We see this in the story of Abraham being asked to sacrifice his son. We are taught to view this as a test of loyalty, a beautiful moment of submission. But look at it honestly. It is a story about a father willing to murder his terrified child because a voice in his head told him to. A moral person would say no. A moral person would protect the child. Religion teaches that the correct answer is to pick up the knife. This severs the link between morality and harm. As long as you are following orders, you are absolved of the consequences of your actions. It allows good people to do terrible things with a clear conscience. And how do you enforce this obedience? You introduce the concept of thought crime. In a free society, we judge people on their actions. We understand that the mind is a chaotic place. We all have intrusive thoughts, angry flashes, or moments of envy. But in many religious frameworks, The thought is as bad as the deed. You can commit adultery in your heart. You can sin by coveting. This creates a surveillance state within your own skull. It is the ultimate totalitarian fantasy, a watcher that never sleeps, who can see every flicker of your neurons. The psychological toll of this is immense. It creates a chronic, low-level anxiety where you are constantly policing your own imagination. You are never truly alone, and you are never truly safe from judgment. It stunts emotional maturity because you cannot process negative emotions. You have to suppress them, lest you be convicted of a sin for merely feeling them. This suppression is most visible in the demonization of human sexuality. There is an obsession in religious doctrine with controlling what consenting adults do with their bodies. By framing natural human impulses as dirty, shameful, or essentially evil, religion creates a neurosis where there shouldn't be one. It turns a biological function into a source of immense guilt. Consider the purity culture narratives that compare people, usually women, to chewed gum or tape that has lost its stickiness if they have engaged in sexual activity. This devalues human beings based on a biological history that harms no one. It teaches us that our worth is tied to our abstinence. It ruins relationships before they begin by wrapping intimacy in layers of shame and fear. It is a teaching that has no basis in reducing harm. It is entirely about control and ownership. And speaking of ownership, we cannot ignore the scriptural endorsement of slavery. It is common for apologists to say that slavery in holy texts was different or indentured servitude. But when you read the texts, the instructions are clear. They treat humans as property. They provide rules for how badly you can beat your slaves, as long as they don't die within a day or two, because they are your money. The evil here isn't just that people in the Bronze Age owned slaves, it's that these texts are held up as the timeless, perfect word of a supreme moral being. By refusing to condemn slavery explicitly, and instead regulating it, these teachings provided the moral cover for atrocities for centuries. It freezes the morality of a primitive time and insists we respect it in the modern world. It forces modern believers to engage in mental gymnastics to defend the indefensible. This connects to the broader teaching of tribalism, the concept of the chosen people or the saved. Almost every major religion creates a sharp division between the in-group and the out-group. It is not just we disagree with them, it is we are beloved by the creator of the universe and they are destined for destruction. This is the root of sectarian violence. It dehumanizes the outsider. If you believe that the person across the border is an enemy of God, or an infidel, or spiritually inferior, it becomes much easier to justify taking their land, their rights, or their lives. It creates a cosmic apartheid. Secular tribalism exists, of course, but religious tribalism adds a layer of divine mandate. You aren't just fighting for resources, you are fighting for the ultimate truth. This transforms manageable political conflicts into intractable holy wars that can span generations. And what happens when you die in these conflicts? That brings us to the glorification of martyrdom and the fetishization of death. Many faiths teach that this life is merely a testing ground, a waiting room for the real life that comes after. This devaluation of our current existence is profoundly harmful. If you truly believe that the best part of your existence starts after your brain dies, you are less likely to invest in fixing this world. Why worry about climate change if the world is prophesied to burn anyway? Why fix systemic injustice if the poor will be rewarded in heaven? It acts as a sedative. It allows us to tolerate the intolerable because we think it's temporary. It shifts the focus from how do we make life better to how do we secure a good spot in the afterlife. It is a theft of the only life we know for a fact that we have. This brings us to the darkest teaching of all, hell. The concept of eternal conscious torment. Let's look at the logic of this. We are finite beings. We have a finite lifespan, finite knowledge, and a finite capacity to cause harm. Yet, for the crime of not being convinced by the evidence, or for breaking arbitrary rules during this blink of an existence, the punishment is infinite. There is no proportion here. Even the worst human criminal eventually dies and stops suffering. But the religious hell is a monument to sadism. It teaches that the ultimate authority in the universe is willing to torture sentient beings forever, without any goal of rehabilitation. It is suffering for the sake of suffering. Terror is the mechanism. Parents teach this to their children. They tell toddlers that if they aren't good, or if they don't believe the right things, they will burn. This is psychological abuse on a massive scale. It installs a phobia that can last a lifetime, even after a person walks away from the faith. The fear of hell is a trap designed to keep you from asking questions. Because if asking questions risks your eternal soul, you will shut up and obey. It is the ultimate weapon of coercion. Alongside this fear, we find the glorification of suffering in this life. There is a pervasive teaching that pain is holy, that suffering brings you closer to the divine. You see this in the refusal of pain management, the denial of death with dignity, and the praise of poverty. When you reframe misery as a spiritual gift, you stop trying to alleviate it. We saw this famously with figures who ran houses for the dying, where basic medical care was withheld because the suffering of the poor was seen as something beautiful to be offered up to God. This is a grotesque inversion of empathy. Pain is not a virtue. Pain is a biological warning signal that something is wrong. To fetishize it is to abandon our responsibility to help one another. It allows the wealthy and powerful to look at the destitute and say, their suffering is part of a divine plan, rather than their suffering is a policy failure we need to fix. Then there is the specific attack on women found in the doctrine of submission. Across the board, in major monotheistic texts, women are framed as secondary, created from man, for man. They are commanded to be silent, to cover themselves, to obey. This isn't just cultural tradition, it is codified in the texts. It deprives half the human species of autonomy. It reduces women to their function as wives or mothers, stripping away their identity as individuals. When a holy text says a woman cannot teach a man, or that her testimony is worth half that of a man's, it cements a hierarchy that invites abuse. It justifies domestic violence by framing the man as the ruler of the household. You cannot have true gender equality when the creator of the universe is said to prefer men. This hierarchy often extends to the rejection of intellectualism. There is a recurring theme that knowledge is dangerous. Remember the Garden of Eden? The fall of man was caused by eating from the tree of knowledge. The lesson is subtle but clear. Curiosity is a sin. Obedience is better than understanding. This teaching has mutated into modern anti-science rhetoric. When scientific discovery contradicts Scripture, the teaching is to reject the evidence of your own eyes. We see this in evolution denial, in opposition to medical advancements, in the resistance to mental health treatment. By framing secular knowledge as worldly or corrupt, religion creates a bubble where bad ideas can flourish without challenge. It keeps people ignorant to keep them dependent. If you understand how the universe actually works, you have less need for the God of the gaps to explain the lightning or the disease. We must also consider the concept of vicarious redemption, the idea that you can scapegoat your crimes onto someone else. This is the core mechanism of animal sacrifice, and later, the crucifixion. The idea is that justice doesn't require the perpetrator to make amends. It just requires blood. If something innocent dies, the guilty can go free. This twists our understanding of responsibility. If I steal from you, justice is me returning what I stole and facing the consequences. Justice is not me killing a goat or a human appearing 2,000 years later to take the blame for me. This teaching essentially says that moral debts can be paid by an innocent party. It devalues personal accountability. It teaches that you don't have to do the hard work of fixing what you broke. You just need to accept the sacrifice. It is a moral shortcut. Let's move to the idea of fatalism, or God's will. This is the teaching that everything happens for a reason and is orchestrated by a higher power. While this can be comforting in grief, it is paralyzing in practice. If a disaster strikes, or a child gets sick, or a war breaks out, labeling it God's will breeds passivity. It suggests that interfering might be going against the plan. It leads to statements like thoughts and prayers, replacing legislation and action. It allows us to look at preventable tragedies, famines, plagues, shootings, and shrug our shoulders, attributing them to a mysterious divine mystery rather than human negligence. It acts as a buffer against outrage. If God wanted it to be different, he would have changed it, right? So why should we bother? This fatalism is the enemy of progress. Another insidious teaching is the concept of apostasy as a crime. In many religions, you are free to join, but you are not free to leave. Leaving the faith is often framed as the ultimate betrayal, punishable by shunning, disownment, or in some theological legal systems, death. This is the behavior of a cult, not a community. It holds relationships hostage. People stay in religions they no longer believe in because they are terrified of losing their families, their spouses, and their support networks. This enforced conformity creates a community based on fear rather than shared values. It is essentially emotional blackmail codified as holy law. If a truth is real, it should stand up to scrutiny, and it shouldn't need to threaten you to keep you believing it. We also see the harm in the prosperity gospel and the monetization of hope, the teaching that wealth is a sign of God's favor and poverty a sign of a lack of faith is a perfect mechanism for scamming the vulnerable. It encourages the poor to give their last dollar to wealthy leaders in the hope of a supernatural return on investment. It victim blames the poor for their own condition. If you are struggling, it's not because of the economy or systemic issues. It's because your faith isn't strong enough or you haven't seeded enough money to the church. It is a predatory financial scheme wrapped in spiritual language, extracting resources from those who need them most and funneling them to those who need them least. Consider the teaching of human exceptionalism, the idea that the entire universe was made specifically for us. This anthropocentric arrogance disconnects us from the natural world. If the animals and the forests and the rivers are just resources put here for our dominion, we have no moral duty to protect them. We are the masters, they are the inventory. This mindset has contributed significantly to our ecological crisis. We view ourselves as separate from and superior to the ecosystem, rather than a part of it. It blinds us to the biological reality that we are just one species among millions, dependent on a fragile web of life. When you believe the world is a disposable stage set for your personal drama with God, you treat it like a rental car you don't have to return. Finally, we have to address the concept of intolerance of ambiguity. Religion sells certainty. It creates a binary world: good, evil, saved, damned, true, false. But the real world is grey. The real world is complex, nuanced, and often contradictory. By teaching that there is always one absolute, capital T, truth, Religion leaves people ill-equipped to navigate reality. It makes compromise impossible. If you possess the absolute truth, why should you listen to anyone else? Why should you negotiate? It creates a rigidity of mind that shatters when it hits the hard complexity of modern life. It discourages the humility of saying, "I don't know." And "I don't know" is the starting point of all learning, all science, and all growth. These teachings, when taken together, form a lattice that constrains human potential. They utilize fear, shame, and ignorance to maintain structure. They ask us to suspend our better judgment, to ignore our empathy, and to mistrust our own minds. They divide us from one another and from the reality we inhabit. Recognizing these harms isn't about hating believers, it's about valuing humanity enough to demand better ideas. We can have community without cultism. We can have morality without threats. We can have wonder without delusion. We have outgrown the need for these ancient control mechanisms. We can be good simply because it is the right thing to do. And we need to look closer at the arrogance inherent in the missionary mindset, the teaching that one specific cultural narrative is the universal truth for every human being on the planet. This drives the engine of cultural erasure. When a religion claims to hold the only keys to salvation, it views every other culture, every other tradition, and every other belief system not as a unique expression of humanity, but as an error to be corrected. We have seen the historical devastation of this. It justified colonialism under the guise of saving souls. It stripped indigenous peoples of their languages, their names, and their histories, replacing them with foreign names and a foreign god. The teaching is that your heritage is worthless compared to the dogma of the conqueror. It destroys the diversity of human thought in favor of a monochrome, spiritual hegemony. This superiority complex extends to how religious institutions handle their own internal crimes. We must address the doctrine of institutional holiness, the idea that the church itself is a divine entity that must be protected at all costs. This is the logic that leads to the systemic cover-up of abuse. When you teach that a priest or a leader is God's anointed representative, you create a power imbalance that is impossible to police. If admitting that a leader abused a child would bring shame upon the church or shake the faith of the flock, the internal logic of the religion dictates that silence is the lesser evil. The reputation of the institution is placed above the safety of the vulnerable. This isn't just corruption, it is a theological calculation. It sacrifices the victim on the altar of the church's public image. Closely linked to this is the teaching of forgiveness without restitution. While forgiveness can be psychologically healthy, religion often weaponizes it to silence victims. Victims are pressured to forgive their abusers immediately, often while the abuse is still happening, because holding on to anger is framed as a sin. This shortcuts the healing process. It demands that the traumatized person do the emotional labor of absolving the perpetrator, letting the abuser off the hook without them ever having to change their behavior. We also have to talk about the insidious nature of the just world hypothesis, which is amplified by religious concepts like karma or blessings. This is the idea that the universe is morally fair, that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. While this sounds nice, the dark side is immediate. When we see someone suffering, our subconscious assumes they must have done something to deserve it. If you believe God is in control and God is just, then the poor, the sick, and the victimized must be under some form of judgment. It erodes empathy. It allows the prosperous to look at their wealth not as a result of luck or privilege, but as divine endorsement of their character. It justifies social stratification. It leads to the sickening conclusion that a child born into famine is suffering for a spiritual reason rather than a geopolitical one. This kind of magical thinking bleeds into medical negligence through the teaching of faith healing. There are doctrines that explicitly state that illness is caused by a lack of faith or spiritual demons. This discourages people from seeking real medical help until it is too late. We see parents withholding insulin or antibiotics from dying children, believing that prayer is the stronger medicine. This is not just a personal tragedy. It is a teaching that rejects the cause and effect reality of the physical world. It views the body as a battleground for spirits rather than a biological machine that needs maintenance. It treats science as a secondary, inferior resort to be used only when the real power of prayer hasn't worked. It creates a culture where dying of a treatable condition is seen as a test of faith rather than a failure of judgment. Let's pivot to the specific toxicity of the phrase, love the sinner, hate the sin. This is often presented as a compassionate middle ground, particularly regarding the LGBTQ+ community. But in practice, it is a psychological weapon. It demands that a person detach themselves from their core identity. If your capacity to love and be loved is defined as the sin, then you are asking someone to hate the part of themselves that makes them human. It enforces a split in the psyche. It tells gay and trans youth that they are welcome only if they suppress who they are. It is a conditional love that feels exactly like rejection. It drives depression and suicide rates because it isolates the individual from their community while pretending to embrace them. It is a form of gaslighting that says, I love you, I just hate everything that makes you happy. Then there is the teaching of scriptural inerrancy, the refusal to admit error. In any other field, science, history, medicine, when we find new information, we update our books. We admit we were wrong. But because these texts are claimed to be authored by a perfect God, they cannot be updated. This traps believers in the moral amber of the past. It forces them to defend the indefensible. If the text says kill the witch, or stone the unruly child, or silence the woman, the fundamentalist cannot say that was wrong. They have to say that was right for its time, or you are interpreting it wrong. It prevents the moral evolution of the religion. It anchors the believer's ethics to the Bronze Age, creating constant friction with modern human rights. It makes the religion brittle. If one verse is wrong, the whole thing might crumble, so every verse must be defended, no matter how cruel. This rigidity fuels the concept of blasphemy. This is the teaching that the creator of the cosmos is so fragile that he needs human beings to violently defend his reputation against words or cartoons. It legitimizes violence against artists, writers, and thinkers. It creates a censorship zone around religious ideas. If you can be killed or imprisoned for criticizing an idea, that idea is not being held up by truth, it is being held up by force. Blasphemy laws are the ultimate admission of insecurity. A truth does not need a sword to defend it. By teaching that offense against God is a crime worthy of punishment, religion hands a loaded gun to the extremist and says, shoot anyone who hurts your feelings. We must also consider the impact of end times prophecy on real-world geopolitics. Millions of people are taught that the world is destined to end in a specific, violent cataclysm centered around the Middle East. This is not just a story, it shapes foreign policy. If you believe that war in the Holy Land is a prerequisite for the return of the Messiah, you will not work for peace. You will work for escalation. It creates a death cult on a global scale. It makes people indifferent to the long-term survival of the human species. Why worry about nuclear proliferation or environmental collapse if you believe the clock is ticking down to a divine rescue operation? It turns the potential extinction of humanity into a spectator sport that believers are cheering for. It is a self-fulfilling prophecy that risks burning down the world because a book said it would happen. Related to this is the demonization of the worldly. Believers are often taught to be in the world, but not of it. This creates a psychological wall between the believer and the rest of society. Art, music, movies, and books that do not explicitly glorify the religion are viewed with suspicion or labeled as demonic influence. It culturally isolates children. It deprives them of the richness of the human experience. It frames secular joy as a trap. It teaches that happiness found outside of the church is counterfeit. This isolation makes it incredibly difficult to leave the faith because the believer has no connection to the culture outside. They are tourists in their own reality, waiting to go home to heaven, ignoring the beauty of the here and now. And what about the teaching of spiritual warfare? This is the idea that negative thoughts, mental illnesses, or political disagreements are the result of invisible demons attacking you. This externalizes responsibility. If your anger is a spirit of anger, you don't need anger management, you need an exorcism. If your child has epilepsy or schizophrenia, and you treat it as a demonic possession, you are abusing that child. We have seen horrific cases of children dying during exorcisms because their medical conditions were interpreted as spiritual battles. On a societal level, it demonizes political opponents. If you believe the other political party is literally aligned with Satan, you cannot compromise with them. You cannot debate them. You have to destroy them. It turns democracy into a holy war. We should also scrutinize the imposition of forced birth and the rejection of bodily autonomy. Many religions teach that a human life exists and has full rights from the moment of conception, often prioritizing this potential life over the actual life and well-being of the mother. This reduces women to vessels. It enforces a biological servitude. It ignores the complex reality of medical necessity, poverty, and the quality of life of the child. By forbidding contraception, these teachings ensure that poverty remains cyclical. They ensure that women remain tethered to the domestic sphere, unable to pursue educational careers, keeping them dependent on the patriarchal structure of the family and the church. It is a mechanism of economic and social control disguised as the sanctity of life. But let's look at the sanctity of life argument when it comes to the teaching of blood sacrifice. At the heart of many faiths is the idea that blood pays for sin. This normalizes violence as a transactional currency. It suggests that the universe runs on a blood economy. If the ultimate act of love is a human sacrifice, the crucifixion, then martyrdom and dying for the cause become the highest honors. It connects back to the glorification of dying. If you look at the history of religious conflict, the promise of paradise for those who fall in battle is the primary recruiting tool. It weaponizes young men. It takes their natural desire for purpose and twists it into a desire for death. It tells them that their life is a small price to pay for eternal glory. It makes human life cheap. There is also the profound dishonesty of mystery. When a religious teaching is illogical, like the Trinity, or the problem of evil, the answer is often, it is a holy mystery. This is an intellectual stop sign. It teaches people to be satisfied with non-answers. It halts the inquiry just when it should be getting deep. We must also address the sectarian fragmentation that insists on minor differences being of major importance. Religion teaches that slight variations in ritual or doctrine are grounds for eternal damnation. This narcissism of small differences tears communities apart. You have people worshipping the same God, reading the same book, but killing each other over how to pray or who the rightful successor was 1,000 years ago. It creates a fractured society where unity is impossible because purity is the priority. It creates an environment where you are constantly looking for the heretic within your own ranks. It leads to endless purging and splintering, preventing large-scale human cooperation. It is anti-social at its core, and let's not forget the suppression of historical literacy. To maintain the narrative of a holy text, religion often has to rewrite history. It has to deny the existence of civilizations that predate the creation. It has to ignore the archaeological record that contradicts the Exodus or the conquest. It forces believers to live in a pseudo-history. This disconnects them from the shared heritage of humanity. If you have to deny carbon dating to keep your faith, you are cutting yourself off from the story of your own species. You are choosing a myth over the magnificent reality of our evolution. It creates a population that is suspicious of experts, suspicious of museums, and suspicious of the very ground they walk on. This suspicion creates a fertile ground for conspiracy theories. If you are already trained to believe that there is an invisible war going on, that nothing is what it seems, and that the world is lying to you, you are prime real estate for political conmen. The bridge between Satan rules the media and the election was stolen by a cabal is a very short walk. The mental architecture is exactly the same. Finally, for this section, consider the teaching that you are never enough. Even if you follow all the rules, pray all the prayers, and pay all the tithes, you are still an unprofitable servant. You can never earn your standing. It is always a gift of grace. This keeps the believer in a state of perpetual debt. You can never pay it back. You are eternally beholden to the institution that dispenses this grace. It creates a dependency loop. It keeps you humble, yes, but it also keeps you on your knees. It prevents the self-actualization that comes from knowing you are a competent, moral, and worthy human being on your own merits. It steals your pride in your own goodness and credits it to the deity. It leaves you empty so it can sell you the refill. The cumulative effect of these teachings is a narrowing of the human horizon. Instead of looking up at the stars with wonder, we are told to look down at the text with obedience. Instead of exploring the vast potential of human ethics, we are told to follow a static code. But the examination doesn't stop here, because the social implications go even deeper into how we structure our families and our laws. And we see this structural impact most clearly in the metaphor of the shepherd and the sheep. This is one of the most common images in religious teaching, framed as a beautiful picture of care and protection. But strip away the pastoral nostalgia and look at what it actually says about human beings. It teaches that we are dumb animals. Sheep are not known for their intellect. They are known for their tendency to get lost, their inability to survive without a master, and their herd mentality. By embracing this identity, believers are conditioned to view independence as danger. It normalizes the idea that humans are incapable of self-governance. It prepares the mind for authoritarianism. If you are a sheep, you don't vote on where the flock goes, you just follow the staff. You don't question the shepherd's motives, even if he's leading you to the shearing shed or the slaughterhouse. It is a teaching that fundamentally dehumanizes us, stripping us of our agency and replacing it with a virtue of mindless following. This grooming for obedience begins with the doctrine of childhood indoctrination. This is perhaps the most normalized form of coercion in our society. The teaching that a child belongs to the faith of their parents before they can speak, read, or reason is a violation of cognitive liberty. We understand that a child cannot consent to a contract, a marriage, or a tattoo, yet we label them a Catholic child or a Muslim child as if their theological worldview is already settled. The Jesuit maxim, "Give me the child for the first 7 years, and I will give you the man," is an admission that the system relies on installing the software before the critical firewall is up. It relies on the biological trust that children have for their parents. When a parent tells a child hell is real, the child accepts it as a fact of reality, like gravity. It wires the brain for fear before it has the capacity to process probability. It is an intellectual clipping of the wings, ensuring that by the time the child is old enough to ask questions, the fear of the answer is already deep in their subconscious. We must also scrutinize the narcissism of personal prayer. This is the teaching that the creator of a universe containing 2 trillion galaxies is personally invested in the trivial details of your day-to-day life. It encourages a worldview where you are the main character of the cosmos. When a believer says, "God found me a parking spot," or "God helped my football team win," they are implying that the deity intervened in the laws of physics for their convenience. But the dark side of this is the implication for those who are not helped. If God stopped the rain for your outdoor wedding, but allowed a typhoon to drown a village in Bangladesh, what does that say about his priorities? And what does it say about the believer's ego? It fosters a profound lack of perspective. It teaches people to interpret random probability as divine favor. It breaks the understanding of cause and effect, replacing it with a superstition that if you just ask nicely enough, the rules of reality will bend for you. This transactional view of the divine leads us to the weaponization of charity, the concept of missionary aid. This is the teaching that helping the poor is a means to an end, not an end in itself. We see this in disaster relief efforts that come with Bibles and sermons. It exploits human desperation to gain converts. It is a form of coercion. Here is the food and water you need to survive, but first, you must listen to our message about why your indigenous beliefs are wrong. True altruism asks for nothing in return. But religious charity often comes with strings attached. It targets the most vulnerable populations, orphans, the sick, the starving, because they have the least resistance to new ideas. It turns humanitarian crises into marketing opportunities. It teaches that the physical well-being of a person is secondary to their ideological alignment. It is predatory kindness. And what protects this predatory behavior? The teaching of spiritual blindness. This is a defense mechanism built into the doctrine. It says that if someone disagrees with the faith or points out its contradictions, it is not because they have a valid point. It is because they are blinded by sin or the devil. This dehumanizes the critic. It tells the believer that they don't need to listen to the atheist or the skeptic because those people are spiritually disabled. It creates a closed loop where the believer is the only one who can see reality. It invalidates all outside critique before it is even heard. It is the ultimate silencer of debate. You cannot reason with someone who believes your logic is a symptom of a spiritual sickness. It insulates the bad idea from the very process that could correct it. Let's talk about the demonization of pride. In religious contexts, pride is often listed as the deadliest sin. While arrogance is unpleasant, the religious definition of pride often includes self-confidence, intellectual independence, and the refusal to submit. By framing self-esteem as a sin, religion keeps people small. It teaches that any credit for your achievements belongs to God, but all the blame for your failures belongs to you. If you succeed, you are blessed. If you fail, you are flawed. This asymmetry destroys self-worth. It prevents people from taking ownership of their own capabilities. It brands the desire for self-determination as rebellion. It tells you that to be good, you must diminish yourself. This diminishment extends to the policing of private sexuality, specifically the immense guilt attached to masturbation. This is a teaching that invades the most private moments of a person's life. By labeling a natural, harmless biological release as a sin against the body, religion creates a neurosis where there should be none. It forces people to confess their private habits to clergy. Think about the power dynamic there. You have young people taught to feel dirty for having a body that works. You have adults carrying shame for decades over something that hurts absolutely no one. It wastes immense amounts of mental energy on fighting a biological drive, energy that could be spent on literally anything else. It is a mechanism of control that ensures you never feel clean without the Church's absolution. Then there is the God of the gaps, the teaching that God is the explanation for everything science hasn't solved yet. While this seems harmless, it is actively anti-progress. Throughout history, every time we didn't understand something, lightning, disease, in the motion of the planets, we called it God. When we found the real answer, God retreated. But the teaching persists. It encourages people to look for mystery rather than answers. It views scientific explanation as a threat to faith. If you believe the complexity of the eye proves a designer, you stop asking how the eye evolved. It teaches that ignorance is where God lives. It incentivizes the maintenance of ignorance. It pits the believer against the expansion of human knowledge. We also have to address the broken window fallacy of religious morality, the teaching that without religion there would be no moral baseline. We hear this constantly. If you don't believe in God, what stops you from murdering people? This is a terrifying admission. It implies that the only thing holding the believer back from violence is a leash held by an invisible master. It insults the evolutionary history of our species. We are social primates. We evolved empathy and cooperation because they helped us survive. We don't kill our neighbors because we understand that other people are real and their suffering matters, not because we fear hell. By teaching that morality comes from an external book, religion erodes our trust in our own internal moral compass. It makes us think we are monsters who need a cage. This distrust of the self connects to the dualism of body and soul. The teaching that the real you is a spirit trapped in a disposable meat vessel leads to the neglect of the physical self and the physical world. If the body is just a shell, why take care of it? If the earth is just a temporary testing ground, why save it? It alienates us from our own biology. It creates a split where bodily needs, hunger, sex, comfort, are seen as enemies of the spirit. It fosters an adversarial relationship with one's own existence. You are at war with your own nature. It prevents us from fully inhabiting the only life we know we have. It makes us ghosts in our own lives, waiting to be released rather than living beings engaged with the world. Consider the implications of intercessory prayer as a substitute for action. The teaching that prayer works is not just factually unsupported, it is socially dangerous. It allows people to feel like they have done something about a tragedy without actually lifting a finger. It acts as a pressure release valve for social conscience. When a school shooting happens or a war breaks out, thoughts and prayers flood the airwaves. This creates a false sense of participation. If you believe you have petitioned the ruler of the universe to fix the problem, you are less likely to donate money, vote for change, or protest. It breeds complacency. It allows us to tolerate the intolerable because we have outsourced the solution to a silent sky. And we must look at the aesthetic of humility masking the reality of greed. We are taught that faith is about the poor, the meek, and the humble. Yet, the institutions that preach this are often the wealthiest organizations on the planet, sitting on billions in untaxed real estate, gold, and art. The teaching of tithing, giving 10% of your income, hits the poor the hardest. It is a regressive tax on the faithful. We see pensioners sending their heating money to televangelists who own private jets. The teaching that God loves a cheerful giver is used to strip assets from the vulnerable to build monuments to the egos of the leaders. It is a wealth transfer from the bottom to the top, sanctioned by divine decree. Then there is the teaching of teleology, the idea that everything has a specific, preordained purpose. This leads to the natural law arguments used to discriminate against anything that doesn't fit the norm. If you believe God designed men for X and women for Y, then anyone who steps outside those boxes is broken. It rejects the messiness and variety of nature. It claims that a gay person, or a transgender person, or a person who chooses not to have children, is malfunctioning. It tries to force the complexity of biology into a simple, binary, theological framework. It leads to conversion therapy and the denial of rights, all based on a childish understanding of how nature works. We also need to talk about the concept of testing, the idea that horrific suffering, cancer in a child, the loss of a spouse, a natural disaster is a test from God. This is a monstrous way to frame trauma. It turns the victim into a subject of a cruel experiment. It forces the grieving person to search for a lesson in their pain instead of just processing the grief. It makes them wonder, what is God trying to teach me by killing my mother? This creates immense cognitive dissonance. It demands that you love the entity that is torturing you. It is the logic of an abusive partner. I'm only hurting you to make you better. It prevents honest emotional healing. Linked to this is the fetishization of tradition. The teaching that because something has been done for 1,000 years, it must be right. This is the anchor that drags societal progress. Every civil rights movement, from ending slavery to women's suffrage to gay marriage, had to fight against religious tradition. Religion provides the no to every new yes of human rights. It argues that the old ways were ordained by God, so change is heresy. It preserves the prejudices of our ancestors and forces us to relitigate them in every generation. It values the dead past over the living present. And let's not overlook the specific danger of biblical patriotism, the merging of national identity with religious identity. We see this in the idea that a specific nation is a Christian nation or a Muslim nation. This excludes millions of citizens who don't share that faith. It creates second-class citizens. It suggests that you cannot be a true patriot unless you pray to the specific God of the majority. It erodes the secular foundations of democracy. It paves the way for theocracy. When you believe your constitution is inferior to your scripture, you are a danger to a free society. Finally, consider the teaching of the sin of doubt. We touched on faith, but the specific vilification of doubt ensures that the system is self-sealing. Doubt is the engine of correction. It is how we find errors and fix them. By labeling doubt as a sin, religion breaks the safety mechanism of the human mind. It traps people in bad ideas forever. It makes them afraid of their own intellect. It creates a world where changing your mind is a weakness, where admitting you were wrong is a failure, and where holding on to a lie is called steadfastness. These teachings, when viewed collectively, reveal a system designed to perpetuate itself at the expense of human flourishing. They target our vulnerabilities, our fear of death, our need for belonging, our shame, and use them as leverage to demand obedience. They create a problem we didn't have, to sell us a cure that doesn't work. Moving away from these teachings isn't about losing morality or community, it's about graduating. It's about realizing that we are capable of being kind without the threat of hell. We are capable of finding purpose without a divine plan. We are capable of facing the universe as it is vast, indifferent, and beautiful, without needing a fairy tale to make it safe. We can be the shepherds of our own lives.